Leclerc shines. Hamilton is left baffled. Two Ferrari teammates, same car, same track, same session, and somehow completely different afternoons. How does that even happen? Stick with me, because sprint qualifying at Zandvoort just delivered one of the most confusing, most dramatic storylines of Ferrari's entire 2026 season, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what went right for one driver, what went catastrophically wrong for the other, and why this result could matter far more than a single Friday session usually would. Let's set the scene. Formula One returned from its 4-week summer break this weekend at Circuit Zandvoort, home of the Dutch Grand Prix, for the penultimate sprint weekend of the season. That break format matters here because sprint weekends only give teams a single hour of practice before sprint qualifying begins. 1 hour to understand a track, dial in a setup, and prepare for a knockout qualifying session on one of the narrowest, most unforgiving circuits on the entire calendar. Any mistake in that condensed window can define your entire weekend before the real action even starts. And this weekend, that 1 hour gamble split Ferrari's garage right down the middle. Let's start with the good news, because Charles Leclerc delivered exactly the kind of lap Ferrari needed. He qualified third for Saturday's sprint, missing pole position by just 55 thousandths of a second. 55 thousandths. That's not a gap, that's a blink. And Leclerc didn't downplay how good it felt. He called it his best qualifying lap of the entire year. Think about that for a second. Out of every qualifying session across an entire 24-race season, at every kind of circuit, in every kind of condition, Leclerc singled out this exact lap on this specific brutal banked circuit as his standout performance of 2026. He wasn't shy about explaining why either. He admitted he would have preferred pole position, but was genuinely pleased with the result, especially given the circumstances. Formula One returning fresh off the summer break, with just that single hour of practice to prepare. Considering those conditions, producing your best lap of the year isn't luck. That's precision. That's a driver who trusted his car, trusted his own instincts, and delivered exactly when it mattered. Now here's where the story flips completely. Lewis Hamilton, driving the exact same specification Ferrari, on the exact same circuit, under the exact same conditions, could only manage 7th place. 7th. More than half a second slower than his own teammate in an identical car. In Formula One, where races are routinely decided by fractions of a second, a half-second gap between two drivers in the same machinery isn't just disappointing, it's the kind of number that raises immediate, serious questions. So what actually happened? According to reports from inside the paddock, Hamilton's final push lap in sprint qualifying looked genuinely rough. Rough enough on its own to explain a 0.6 gap back to Leclerc. But it wasn't simply a case of a driver having an off day. Hamilton himself described the car as feeling completely different during the session, pointing toward unexplained handling changes that caught him off guard. This wasn't Hamilton driving poorly out of nowhere. This was a 7-time world champion sitting in a car that, by his own account, didn't feel like the machine he'd been driving all season. And Hamilton didn't try to hide from it afterward either. Speaking to media after the session, he was direct about what needs to happen next. He and the team need to sit down and figure out what went wrong. That's not the language of a driver making excuses. That's the language of someone who knows something genuinely went sideways with the car's setup or balance, and who wants real answers before this turns into a pattern. Here's what makes this even more significant when you zoom out to the bigger championship picture. This wasn't just about Ferrari's internal pecking order for one sprint session. The entire session was one of the tightest in recent memory. The top 4 cars were separated by less than 1/10 of a second. George Russell claimed a surprise pole position for Mercedes, beating Lando Norris by just 41 thousandths of a second, with Leclerc splitting the two McLarens for third. That means Hamilton wasn't just half a second off his teammate. He was over 0.6 off the very front of a session where the top 4 cars were separated by practically nothing. In a session this tight, half a second isn't a small deficit. It's an enormous one. And Hamilton wasn't the only championship contender who struggled either. Kimi Antonelli, the current championship leader coming into this weekend, had his own difficult session, sliding off into the gravel during an earlier segment and damaging the floor of his Mercedes, eventually settling for 5th. Max Verstappen, racing in front of his home crowd at Zandvoort, could only manage sixth in what was his first competitive session of the weekend. So this wasn't purely a Ferrari story. Several of the sport's biggest names struggled to find their rhythm coming out of the summer break. But the contrast inside Ferrari's own garage, one driver producing his best lap of the year, the other completely baffled by his own car, is what makes this specific storyline stand out above everything else. So here's the real question worth sitting with. How do two drivers in identical machinery on the exact same circuit end up with results this far apart? Is this simply about two different approaches to a single high-pressure practice hour? Leclerc finding the right setup window early, Hamilton chasing changes that ultimately worked against him? Or does this point to something deeper, something about how Ferrari is managing setup direction between its two drivers during a season where both of them are fighting for real championship positions? Because that's what makes this genuinely high stakes, rather than just an interesting one-off. Hamilton currently sits inside the top 3 of the World Drivers' Championship, in real title contention for the first time since 2021. Every point matters. Every session matters. A rough sprint. Qualifying isn't just an embarrassing afternoon, it's genuine championship ground that becomes harder to make up as the season narrows toward its final rounds. Ferrari can't afford a scenario where one of their two title-contending drivers is regularly a half-second or more off the pace of his own teammate, especially not this late in the year, with the sport's showpiece sprint and Grand Prix sessions still to come this very same weekend. There's also a broader story here about resilience versus consistency, something that's followed Hamilton through his entire first season and a half at Ferrari. This is a driver capable of producing genuinely brilliant weekends. A win in Barcelona, a near pole in Hungary just a few weeks ago, missing the top of the timesheet by only 12 thousandths of a second. But those spectacular highs have been shadowed, again and again, by moments exactly like this one. Sessions where the car simply doesn't cooperate, where confidence and machine don't line up the way they need to. Leclerc, meanwhile, appears to be building something different this year. Not necessarily more spectacular highs, but a more consistent baseline, week after week, that's starting to look like genuine championship-caliber form. So what happens next? That's where this story gets even more urgent, because sprint qualifying isn't the end of the weekend. It's just the opening chapter. Saturday brings the actual sprint race itself, followed immediately by qualifying for Sunday's full Grand Prix. That means Hamilton has 2 more direct opportunities, within the space of a single day, to answer the questions this session just raised. Does Ferrari find what went wrong with his car in time for the sprint? Does he claw back into genuine championship contention by Sunday afternoon? Or does this baffling Friday turn into a genuinely costly weekend, right as the title fight enters its most critical stretch? Nobody watching from outside Ferrari's garage can answer that yet. What we do know right now is this. Charles Leclerc just produced his best qualifying lap of the entire 2026 season on one of the most demanding circuits in the sport, with almost no practice time to prepare. And in the very same car, on the very same circuit, Lewis Hamilton was left searching for answers, half a second off the pace, and openly admitting something felt wrong. That contrast, inside a single team in a single session, is exactly why this weekend matters so much more than a typical Friday qualifying result usually would. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think Ferrari can turn this around for Hamilton before Sunday's Grand Prix, or is this the start of a genuinely costly weekend for his championship push? And does Leclerc's form right now suggest he's quietly becoming Ferrari's strongest title threat instead? Drop your prediction in the comments below before the sprint race gets underway. I read every single one, and I want to know exactly where you stand. And if this breakdown helped you actually understand what just happened inside Ferrari's garage, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because we'll be back the second the sprint race and Sunday's Grand Prix qualifying wrap-up to tell you whether Hamilton bounced back or whether this weekend got even harder. Drop a like if you're rooting for Hamilton to turn this around, share this with another F1 fan who needs to see the full story, and I'll see you in the next one.